people who were wrapped up in the politics of these movements became very self-referential. And for them, an identity was not something that bound people together and to the country, but rather became a kind of way of reflecting on difference. And a lot of social movements broke apart on the basis of identity resentments. And so the New Left broke apart for all kinds of reasons, but one of them is that African Americans complained that they weren't part of the leadership, which is true. Women complained that they weren't part of the leadership, which was true. Lesbians complained that feminists were normalizing heterosexuality, which was also true. And so the united front of the left broke down over these identity issues. And then what happened is that there was a retreat to the universities. And so people on the left really abandoned electoral politics in these groups and instead developed this idea that all social change happens through social movements that are tied to identity. And you end up with gender theory, you end up with race theory, you end up with feminist theory, and you end up now with maybe 3 generations of young people, liberal elites, who've been brought up in the university to think about politics in terms of group and their own individual identities, rather than of the common good and a message that might bind us together as a nation.
Yeah, you have a nice passage here on what happened to the New Left. I'm quoting you. The New Left was torn apart by all the intellectual and personal dynamics that plague every left, plus a new one, identity. Racial divisions were quick to develop. Blacks complained that most leaders were white, which was true. Feminists complained that most all were men, which was also true. Soon black women were complaining both about the sexism of radical black men and the implicit racism of white feminists, who themselves were being criticized by lesbians for presuming the naturalness of the heterosexual family. What all these groups wanted from politics was more than social justice and an end to the war, though they did want that. They also wanted there to be no space between what they felt inside and what they did out in the world. They wanted to feel at one with the political movements that mirrored how they understood and defined themselves as individuals. And I love that. I mean, that picture of fragmentation seems exactly what has happened. And you have this, what has been described as the oppression Olympics, where there's an economy of victimhood where certain identities trump others. And if you are a black lesbian, you're somewhere near the apex of grievance, and therefore more or less anything you say is undeniable by someone who doesn't share your identity. If you're a black, lesbian, Muslim, well then, better yet. So I've been paying a little attention to the reception of that your book has gotten. And so I noticed, for instance, the review in the New York Times, which had to be annoying to you. It was annoying to me. I hadn't even read your book, and it was obvious that review was silly and unfair. And then I also saw the interview you did with David Remnick in The New Yorker, and he seemed, again, desperate to shore up some concept of identity politics. What has been your experience thus far in making your case post-publication, and why do you think people are not readily seeing what is wrong with identity politics, both politically as a matter of just political pragmatics, but also intellectually and morally?
Well, I think one of the reasons, there are 2 reasons, I think. One of the reasons is that identity politics has really become an evangelical project, and or it has all the markings of American revivalist religion. The fact that we use the word woke, which comes from conversion, the great awakenings in this country, and especially over the past 3-4 years, for some reason, we've gotten into a panic about a lot of these issues that are real issues, but they've been around for a long time, and suddenly there's developed a hypersensitivity about certain things, and there are reasons for that. what's happened with African Americans and the police and various other things, Charlottesville. There are reasons for that, but it's also become dogmatic in the sense that it's not that people want you to agree with them or even just to work with you. They want you to believe, they want you to accept their version of American history, their critique of American society, their particular critique of the police. And while you may agree with some of those things, what you look for in politics is kind of common ground, what you can agree on, like police mistreatment of African American motorists, for example, and you can work on that together. So, they become people who won't take yes for an answer, I think, often. But the other thing is, I have felt in the reaction to the book that I put my finger on a real nerve or a sore spot. And that is that I keep saying in interviews, as I say in the book, that protecting minority groups is what we do as liberals. That's what we're about. You cannot protect anyone if you don't hold institutional power. Institutional power in this country is not just held in the presidency, it's held in the courts, Congress, and especially at the state and local level. If you are not competitive at the state and local level or the congressional level, you cannot protect anybody. Now, the only way to be successful at those levels is to have a message that reaches beyond your identity group. Therefore, if you want to actually protect African Americans, gays and lesbians just walking down the street holding hands, women who are being paid less than men, you need to hold power. And you have to find a new message, not one based on yourself and your feelings and your identity, but a message about certain principles that you hold and that inform your political commitments, but that other people can also hold. And so these big themes of solidarity and equal protection, I think, just as principles, most Americans hold to if you just ask them. But then once you get down to cases, then you're going to have disagreements, so you can persuade people. But if you say to someone, you must understand me, but you cannot understand me because of who you are, you completely hermetically sealed yourself and you're unable to persuade anyone else. And so your politics become expressive and you fall in love with noble defeats.
You become a bully too. I mean, that is what is left for you to do by way of persuasion, because reason has failed. There is to just bully people with, in this case, the threat of being called a racist. It's interesting. What you just said strikes me as a fairly complete recapitulation of what I recall Hillary Clinton saying when confronted by some Black Lives Matter people at one of her events.
Yeah, I mentioned it briefly in the book, and I forget if it was at that time or not, but they weren't letting her speak. They had adopted these Mau tactics of breaking into meetings, not letting people speak. And I forget if it was then or another time when Hillary Clinton pointed out that Martin Luther King would not have achieved his goals were it not for the practical politician LBJ, who was willing to cut deals with Dixiecrats, and to make the civil rights legislation happen, the Great Society programs. Movements alone cannot achieve anything, and institutional politics can always trump what movements have achieved. I mean, look what's happening at the state and local government in this country. The Democratic Party and feminist groups fought for a constitutional right for a woman to get an abortion. That was achieved. But in large parts of this country, a woman de facto cannot get an abortion. That is not because we haven't marched enough. It isn't because we haven't had enough court cases. It's because Democrats and liberals do not hold power at the state and local level, where in subtle and not so subtle ways, it's become impossible for people to run clinics where a woman can get an abortion. And they also feel under a threat of violence. And the only way to change that, the only way to make that right actual, is to go out to the South and the Southwest and find a way to convince those people to come over to your side. There's no other way. You got to get out of your bubble. You got to get out from behind your laptop, and you've got to go and meet people and talk to them just to reach your ends, not because you need to genuflect to the white working class or Joe Sixpack as if he's some sort of special figure. To achieve what you want to achieve, you've got to get out there.
Now you have argued that, I think you say this in your book, perhaps this was just in an interview, but I believe you've argued that there's an asymmetry here between the right and the left. There's an identity politics of the right as well, but where identity politics is a losing strategy for liberals, it isn't necessarily a losing strategy on the right.
That's right. I mean, it's hard to know what to say about this subject at this moment because 10 years ago, when researchers would ask white people in surveys, how important is your white identity? And you feel whites are being discriminated against, you get maybe 5%. Now the figures are up over 25%. And why is that? Well, it's not that people have always felt that way. Rather, we have a right-wing media almost monopoly on news in parts of this country that have been able to play this up. And they've been able to play it up in part because we on the liberal side keep talking about identity. That's not to say that identity politics creates racism. It is to say that it can make it more salient at different moments. And, the rise of this white consciousness, it's tied to all sorts of things, including social changes that have happened in the country, economic changes, the the rise of a black middle class, the fact that, women are in the workplace, and and also the growth of a non-working white male population. But so, we're in a funny moment right now, but in this moment, at least, it's certainly clear. And Steve Bannon said this himself, that the more we talk about difference and engage in sort of campus opera buffa, the more we help recruit people to the other side to say we have an identity too. Breitbart ran an article about my book saying we've been saying this stuff for years and it's been working for us. And Steve Bannon said that in his famous interview with Bob Kuttner that got him fired. He said, keep talking about that issues. It's working for me, man. Just keep talking about them.
Yeah, and on one level, it's just if you're going to practice identity politics, you shouldn't be surprised when white people eventually practice identity politics of their own. But is it a consequence of the fact that whites are still a majority in the country, it doesn't, the identity aspect of it doesn't prove to be a liability in the same way? I mean, to give you just a little more material here, I wanted to read another passage which points up that, again, I don't know if this is the same asymmetry, but it certainly is an asymmetry where you talk about how the web pages of the two parties differ. And you talk about, on the Republican site at the time you wrote this, there was essentially a white paper titled Principles for American Renewal. And it was just a statement of positions of the party and just a vision for, where the party wanted to take the country. And then you said on the Democratic website, there was no such document. Now I'm quoting you. There's no such document to be found on the Democrats' homepage. Instead, when you scroll to the bottom of it, you find a list of links titled People, and each link takes you to a page tailored to appeal to a distinct group and identity: women, Hispanics, quote, ethnic Americans, the LGBT community, Native Americans, African Americans, Asian Americans, and Pacific Islanders. There are 17 such groups and 17 separate messages. you might think that by some mistake you've landed on the website for the Lebanese government, not a party with a vision for America's future. I mean, I don't know if that's the same geometry of weakness there, but you can see how that kind of fragmentation, where we means nothing but diverse groups, each of which is solely empowered to attest to its own grievances by virtue of its identity. That's not a moral or a political foundation from which to argue in ways that will attract people from outside your group to form a common cause with you.
Yeah, one thing I've learned in talking about the book is that I should have emphasized one thing more that I say, but I needed to put it front and center. And that is that you cannot understand any social problem in America without talking about identity. You can't understand poverty. You cannot understand unemployment. You can't understand incarceration policy if you don't address how these policies affect many of these different groups. That's absolutely right. And we're more aware of that now, and that's a good thing. But when it comes to addressing those problems and building a common vision for the country that will appeal to people who aren't members of those groups, that's the time to employ a different kind of rhetoric. And so often the response I'm getting from people is, but how can we not talk about identity because identity is important in all these ways? That's true. So when you analyze a problem, you know what your commitments are once you understand the role of identity in this country. But in order to follow through and achieve a result out there and not simply express yourself and make yourself heard, politics is not a speech act. Politics requires a common effort and persuasion, not self-expression. And so it requires a kind of double-mindedness, I would say now, about identity, recognizing it to understand the country, speaking in a different way in order to try to do something about it.
I guess I'm going to sound more skeptical of identity than you do, at least in this moment. I mean, again, I hear you arguing that it's politically imprudent to emphasize identity as a matter of moving forward, but I just actually think that for most of the problems, and certainly for every problem where identity isn't actually the relevant variable, it represents a moral and intellectual error to be speaking in terms of identity. So I'm thinking of what the writer and philosopher Rebecca Goldstein recently said. She said, to the extent that we're rational, we share the same identity. That really gets at the heart of what my concern is with identity politics. It's that, I mean, that is what it is to be rational. Rationality is how we fuse our cognitive horizons with strangers who are capable of reasoning in the same way based on the same evidence. And so, by that measure, identity politics is a failure of rationality. And so, I meant to give you an example that will make this clear. If you and I were going to talk about what's wrong with Black Lives Matter right now as a movement, we as two white guys talking about this, we are guaranteed, absolutely guaranteed, to be attacked as racists by people in that movement just for speaking critically about it, no matter how legitimate our criticism is. And these charges of racism will come without any evidence to substantiate them, apart from the fact that we spoke critically about the movement, and without any apparent awareness of a burden to rebut the substantive points we actually made about the movement. So, I mean, this gets at the heart, again, of what I think is so toxic about identity politics, is that, I mean, if there are things that are wrong with Black Lives Matter, the color of a person's skin is totally irrelevant when pointing these things out. And the core of Black Lives Matter seems to be not understanding that fact. And obviously, I'm not saying that a person's life experience doesn't reveal certain problems to him or conceal others from him. And this is a point you make in the book, and this is a point I've made on this podcast. A white guy like me or you can't claim to know what it's like to be a black man driving a car and being pulled over by the cops and searched without due cause. If it's not an experience we've had, there's something we're missing there. But I would argue we're not missing the important piece when actually talking about injustice in our society. And if you're going to argue, I'm not saying you, but if one is going to argue that the core problems of justice and fairness and equality can't be argued for in a way that transcends race, it just strikes me as manifestly untrue and also totally counterproductive for the people who need those arguments most right now.